Welcome to the Change Leadership Masterclass. This is the second session in the series. It is a panel discussion. Today, we are honored to speak with 4 experts from HR, change management, and tech about their perceptions and experience with change leadership. I will have them introduce themselves to you in just a moment. Today, we will focus on what defines change leadership, why it is important, and how it is evolving, how our experts implement these competencies into their work, and what you can do to grow your change leadership competency. We will conclude our discussion with a question and answer session. If you have questions for the panelists, please drop your question in the Q&A box, and we will address all questions during the question and answer time at the end of our discussion. Panelists, thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy day to talk with us. I'd love for you to introduce yourselves at this time. Yvonne, would you like to start?
Hi, thank you, Jen. Great to be here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Yvonne Ruke Akpoveta. I am a change management strategist and also the founder of the Change Leadership, which is a community course content platform where we provide resources to help professionals and organizations respond to change better and faster. And I love to call myself, I hadn't seen it before, but I call myself a change leadership advocate. I am very big on change leadership because I believe it is such a valuable skill that makes a difference in the workplace. You know, it makes a difference to employee mental well-being, the success or failure of initiatives. And when we talk about employee mental well-being, you know, we all know what happens when an organization fails. It affects employees, it affects the community at large, it affects the economy. So I'm a very big advocate for change being done right and what it can do for our mental well-being as well. I'm excited to be here and to be discussing this topic. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Yvonne. Traci, would you like to go next?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this discussion, and I just second everything Yvonne said. I am the host and creator of my own podcast. It's called Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources. And naturally, every hobby also has a career. And so in my career, I'm a director of employee engagement for Legion Technologies. And I've spent almost 10 years of my career in HR, but specifically in retail. So I've made the switch recently to tech. But I'm here to be the living and breathing advocate for being able to really make skill sets transferable. And so I'm really excited that today we'll be talking about a skill set that I think, just like Yvonne said, is super critical and important. And I'm just really glad to be here. So thank you again.
Thank you, Traci. Happy that you're here. Hi, Stephen. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone, or morning or afternoon, depending on where specifically you are. My name is Stephen Jaye. I'm a product manager. I'm also the creator and host of a podcast called Antidotes, which tells the stories about people who follow their passions in hopes that others, listeners, will be inspired to follow theirs. A kind of very similar theme. I'm also a business coach and community organizer, so I do kind of a lot of different things. And one of the things that I have experience with is I've changed jobs a lot, and I've worked with a lot of different types of people and a lot of different types of organizations, and have experienced the good, the bad, and the ugly, I'd say.
Thank you, Stephen. Andrew.
Yeah, sure. So I don't have a podcast like everybody else, just one thing, but I'm Andrew Kitchner. I'm the founder of the surveying company, New Wave Solutions. I'm happy to talk about it more, but I'm excited to be a part of this conversation, mainly to talk with all of you, getting different perspectives, but also I look at change kind of more as an opportunity rather than an obligation. And I think that's something that everybody can do a little bit more of, including myself. So I'm happy to be here. And next time, maybe I'll have a podcast and I'll promote it here.
You're in good company. You know, I don't have a podcast either. I mean, I
feel better.
I mean, I do a lot of LinkedIn lives and contents and all of that, but you're in good company.
Okay, good.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. As you can see, we have a great group of experts here with various backgrounds and experiences. Before we jump into the discussion, I'd like to briefly provide some background about why we're hosting this masterclass series. Yvonne and I both belong to Futocracy Network, a community for people who are interested in the future of change management. We wanted to collaborate to create discussions about change leadership for professionals who were either new to change leadership concepts or who wanted to learn what they could do to develop their skills further. In the network, there have been discussions about how we make change easier for organizations and the individuals who experience them. Yvonne and I are both advocates for individuals. We both are the type of people who enjoy helping others. So we decided to create this 4-part series where people can come together and start to talk about change leadership. Registering for the session will automatically include you in the communications for the next 2 sessions. Our next session will be held March 2nd at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. During that session, we will explore a case study. Be sure to save the date. So let's get started. Yvonne, you train leaders in your program associated with your change leadership community. How do you define change leadership?
Oh my gosh. First of all, the way I define change leadership is to start by differentiating between change leadership and change management, which is often really confused or used interchangeably. So when I think change leadership skills, let's talk about, first of all, I say this all the time, it's no longer reserved for a select few. When we talk change leadership, we're talking more about, the skill-based side of things. We talk about the ability to lead and respond to change, be it on your day-to-day tasks, be it on your projects that you're leading and running. It's the ability to be able to influence other people towards a particular goal, a particular change, a particular objective. And the reason why I said earlier it's important to differentiate it is because, like I said, it's used interchangeably. So when people think change leadership, they think change management at the same time. So maybe, to really help set the stage is to say, change management, for instance, is more a skill set that is very tactical. So you get into a project and the thing that you get asked on the project is, hey, it has a start date, it has an end date. So very often project driven, you have to bring in your tactical skills, you have deliverables associated with it, you may be asked to do your change assessments, you may be asked to do your change strategy, your change management plan. So like I said, dedicated, you often have to maybe involve a methodology where, you have to use one of the change management methodologies out there to follow, be it ProSci, be it, I wouldn't say Cutter because anybody can use Cutter. You use Cutter in change leadership. But, the various models, and there are many models out there, but the very famous one is, and popular one is the ProSci one. Perhaps change leadership is that skill set that can elevate anyone's career. And when we talk about today's very fast-paced and disruptive, ever-changing business environment, you find that it's that skill whereby we're all required to have it, because now we have flatter organizational structures. We have to be very agile and responsive in what we're doing, regardless of our role. We're no longer in a place where they're saying, wait for your boss or wait for, in quote, the leader. We're all leaders, but wait for management to make that decision. Now you're being faced with having to make those decisions in what it is you do. So it's fast becoming a very critical competency for everyone. So I would say that's the key difference between those, role. And I hope with showing the difference, it helps also show what change leadership is.
Thank you, Yvonne. And today we're talking about the competencies. For you, when you're working with your students or the organizations that you consult, what are the top change leadership competencies that you find are most important for professionals?
Oh, wow. So when I do training around change leadership, I always focus on 10 core competencies. There are more than 10 competencies, or 10 skill sets that make up, say, maybe change, you being a competent change leader. But some of the things that I focus on that anyone can start to develop right now is influence. So first of all, having just pure leadership skills, influence, being able to lead and influence others to follow. So that one is big. And then there is also empathy. To have empathy is just critical, because a lot of things around change is influence. And in order to build influence, in order to build trust with other people, you can always start with empathy to build that trust, because if you can build trust with people, people will follow you. So empathy is a great skill to have as a change leader. Emotional intelligence, also another great one in terms of skills. Emotional intelligence and empathy go hand in hand together. And if anything has been more important in the last 2 years, it's emotional intelligence and empathy, because we've been going through so much, and we've all learned, and I'm sure my colleagues are going to talk about that today, because Andrew has a great paper on that's driving great resignation, and all of those things. It's that we cannot lead as a collective. We cannot lead holistically and say everybody is the same. In order to more effectively lead, we have to understand individuals and where they are and where they're coming from, because employees are starting to have more autonomy in the way they do things and their work. And so what really helps there is when you have empathy as a point to really understand your stakeholders, understand your team, understand your colleagues, understand your clients, understand the people you're using, working with. So you see, I'm already going on so much about empathy, but I'll mention 2 more, which are very important, is collaboration. So that's co-design, collaboration, being able to work with other people, and that's where you get buy-in and you're able to lead and drive the change. Oh my gosh, so many examples we could talk about worldwide now, when we see what's going on worldwide, where collaboration would have been such a valuable skill to have. Another great one to have, because we did a research in terms of saying what are the top 3 competencies for the change practitioner of the future, or anyone leading and managing change. So one of the ones that came up was also communication. And when we talk about communication, let's not talk about communication to just talk at. That's what we all think communication is. We've told them, so we've communicated. When we talk communication, let's go back to the dictionary definition, which is, to be able to listen to people, to be able to engage, to make it a two-way channel, two-way opportunity, two-way discussion, back and forth. So I'll leave those as 5. Like I said, I teach on 10, where I go really in depth in teaching about, change leadership skills. But I think those 5 are enough, guys. Don't you think?
That's great, Yvonne. Thank you so much for talking with us about that. Now, if you have any questions for Yvonne about change leadership, please post the questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them during the question and answer time. Now that we've defined what change leadership is and why it's important for us to talk about this, let's talk more about how change leadership competencies are evolving. So according to the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report that came out in 2020, 50% of all employees will need reskilling by 2025 as the adoption of technology continues to increase. In addition, according to Deloitte Access Economics, as technology, globalization, and demographic shifts continue to shape how business compete, the importance of soft skills grow. Furthermore, they forecast that soft skills intensive occupations will account for 2/3 of all jobs by 2030. That's compared to half of all jobs in 2000. So now more than ever, it's important for us to talk about change leadership competencies and those soft skills. Andrew, you design surveys for companies and help them gather data related to organizational commitment. What is organizational commitment and how does it relate to change leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jen. So organizational commitment, put simply, it's an employee's commitment to their company's goals, values, and mission. So when we look at change leadership, first of all, like I said earlier, it takes a commitment from leaders to view change as an opportunity. All leaders are going to face it on the macro and micro scale. everything from a daily basis to the larger picture. And it's about consistently framing that change as an opportunity to improve, to learn, to grow, both as an individual and as an organization. As far as organizational commitment, it's an alternative to employee engagement. And what organizational commitment is it's a metric that we found to be incredibly important for change leadership as far as company-wide. And the reason is just put simply, change is difficult. So anytime we've gone through individual change, we know that the most substantial changes and improvements we've made have taken discretionary effort and generally requires us to be unified by a set of goals and values that are bigger than any one individual. And so as far as organizational commitment's role in change leadership, it's about fostering that commitment to seeing change as an opportunity. And then also working together, and this is kind of what we do, to create that two-way communication that Yvonne was speaking about. And that's what we do with employee surveying, is kind of create that two-way communication so that employees can be essentially have the psychological safety to bring up what they feel is missing, whether it be role clarity. A lot of change leaders will talk about how the organization is changing, but not specify how employees' actual role is being affected. So those are just some quick thoughts.
So, and you recently published an employee sentiment report. In it, one statistic that really stuck out for us was that 75% of employees reported that communication and collaboration are less effective when working remotely. I think two things is this really highlights how important communication and collaboration are for our employees, which are key change leadership competencies, and also how this is changing as our roles change as we move online and attempt to communicate with each other over, platforms like this. So can you elaborate on some of these things for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And first off, anybody who's joining us today, if they reach out to me on LinkedIn, Andrew Kitchner, I can send you the report, no cost, no email entry, nothing like that. But one of the things that we see is that, like you said, there are multiple communication barriers, whether it just be silos or actually something that people don't think about too often, which is overly communicating. So if you have 6 meetings in a day, how productive are you actually going to be? How much of that communication do you actually really need? How much of it are you just obligatory? How much of it is essentially just an obligation for you to sit there and absorb the information, but really it's not a good use of your time. So one thing that we always recommend is asking employees just upfront, what do you want more of? What do you want less of? So it's a very simple question structure, but whether that be focused on change leadership or improving communication, that kind of two-directional question is incredibly valuable.
I can imagine that it is, definitely. And I'm sure employees appreciate being asked those questions as well. Traci, in your work as an HR leader, how do you see the competencies in organizations evolving? And how can organizations support that evolution?
This is such a good question. And I feel like I'm going at the perfect time because Andrew and Yvonne really set me up for success with this question, because
You're welcome.
there were so many, thank you. There were so many things that were touched on here that I want to make sure I get to. The first is that I want to set the stage with almost an analogy and an example. If you think to a time that you worked with someone that was not collaborative, demonstrated poor communication skills, maybe wasn't so exciting to work with, that is exactly what change leadership is the antithesis to. Change leadership takes that approach and turns it on its head. And I use that example because I think as people and as leaders ourselves, we have an opportunity to really set the stage for what change leadership means and embracing those leadership skills. And so all of the skills that Yvonne talked about, all of the necessities that Andrew talked about, work hand in hand. And one of the things that I think really is the most important for organizations and leaders of organizations to take away from this dialogue is that we need psychological safety. We need businesses and organizations to set the stage for people who, like us and other change leaders, to really be able to affect that change. And so when I think about my own experience and or experiences in other organizations, what I see as far as the evolution goes, I see businesses actually taking what maybe used to exist, what used to work, and saying, okay, well, this might not work today, or maybe there are pieces of this that work today. And we need to allow for people to offer their opinion, to feel safe and comfortable being part of that change and actually actively changing. And so when I think about some of the competencies and organizations evolving, I do think that organizations are in a pivotal moment today to retain and have an obligation to retain top talent. And so how do they do that? They have to and are obligated to create psychologically safe environments. They have an obligation to talk about things that maybe they've brushed under the rug before, and to reward people who are demonstrating the right behaviors. So to reward people who are actively collaborating with others, to reward people. And when I say reward, that could be something from, public displays of recognition to giving those people opportunities to have learning lunches or have discussions with people from other departments, for example. It could be something super small that makes a big impact, or something that feels super big, like a promotion, that also has an equally big impact. And so I think it's funny because we talk about this in a way that probably feels like it's a huge collaborative effort and every leader needs to get involved and it takes hours and hours and hours of time. But actually all we need to do is empower one person to create an employee resource group to focus on developing power skills. I'm trying to use that instead of soft skills, for example. And then that person can influence. I mean, this is the key word we've been referencing back this whole time, is that one person can influence an entire organizational change. And I think evolution is the word that we're using today, because that's what it is. It's evolving skill sets to go from soft skills to power skills, because those are the skill sets that are taking organizations from startups to unicorns, or from small businesses to enterprises, for example. And I think that there's a real opportunity there.
I think that's great. And I love your use of power skills. I think that's wonderful. I think in that, because sometimes when we talk about soft skills, I don't think we give them enough credit. So
Totally.
Yeah. So Yvonne, did you want to add something to what Traci is saying?
I love what Traci was saying, and she said it so well.
Yeah.
One of the skills that I did not mention, because I said 10, because this, there are 10 skills, is what she said is empower. So that's one of the things that is really big about empowering others. Because when we think about change leadership, we often think it's a title thing, it's a position thing. And like Traci said, you think it's this big thing that we all have to do. A change leader is who we become. That's another way we can describe change leadership and being a change leader. We become it. So it's our ability to really use those power skills, like you ladies have been mentioning, to say, how do we lead and drive change? And we do that by empowering other people to be leaders. And that is the big way you can get buy-in. You can get people to be part of it. You can get that organizational commitment that Andrew was talking about, where people, they feel part of the solution. So guess what? They adopt and they buy into the change. So thank you for bringing up, that's another number 6.
No, this is a really good point, actually. And it reminded me that I wanted to remind myself of this point with the buy-in. And Yvonne, you mentioned how organizations tend to run flat these days, and that everyone is a leader. Some organizations probably have more manager titles than they do non-manager titles. And so what does that mean? I mean, that it literally means that we all have an opportunity to be change leaders, to influence the direction of the organization. And this is why HR people like myself always talk about how every single person owns the culture and owns the engagement of the population, because if we all take the opportunity to create what we want, provided that we are in environments that appreciate individual empowerment and want that change, then I mean, the sky is the limit to be able to create, the organization of our dreams, and to allow ourselves to be the top talent that's retained within our own organizations.
It's really important and great points. Thank you so much, Traci. So we've talked about how change leadership competencies are evolving and started to talk about how to apply them in organizations. Again, if you have any questions for the panelists, please post them in the Q&A box and we'll talk about them in just a short while. And Lynn actually posted something to the chat that kind of transitions us into the next session. She said psychological safety is a key component within Agile mindset. Without psychological safety, it's hard to hear feedback and make changes. So Stephen, you've worked in that field. You're a project manager who leads Agile projects. What challenges do you typically experience with those projects and the people that you work with? And how do change leadership competencies help you to overcome those challenges?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've worked with a lot of engineering teams, the software engineering teams, and people with these, what we call the hard skills, if we were to contrast. And I definitely, Traci, appreciate calling it the power skills, because I've had other people talk about this, the phrasing soft skills being a little bit, shortchanging it. But I like to say that the people with some of these high-tech skills, software developers, data scientists, database engineers, kind of led this whole movement toward more employee empowerment, employees having more power over things, because it's been a while now that these people have had a skill set where they could easily get a job somewhere else. And I've worked with a lot of people that if you're a senior software developer, for example, you could quit your job right now. And I know people who have done this. You can quit your job right now and have 8 recruiters instantly contacting you about other jobs. So there's been this like different balance of power with them for quite a while now. And one of the things is that these are people who have in-demand skill sets, they know it, and they want to feel like they're a part of something, and they want to be kind of, listened to and appreciated, sorry. And one of the things that on top of all these kind of communication skills and influence skills, I cannot talk enough about the importance of what people refer to as active listening. And active listening is, of course, when you're in a conversation with someone, you're listening to what they have to say, and rather than waiting to say what you're going to say next, you don't decide what you're saying next until you've listened to their entire statement. And so this is how I develop the relationships with some of these developers that make them feel listened to, appreciated, and valued. You actively listen to them, and then when they have something to say, when they talk about a struggle, you make them kind of understand that you're on their side and that you understand. One of my favorite stories is about an engineer who reminded me of the importance of, in his view of how the job of a software engineer works, needing 4, 5, 6 hour open periods of time. We actually had an earlier discussion about meetings and how disruptive meetings can be, how a whole day of meetings cannot really be very productive. And this particular individual reminded me that to be an effective software engineer, he needed blocks of time where he wasn't being inundated by meetings or communications over Slack or any other channels. He needed that deep focus to really solve those problems. And what I did was I made good on that. I experimented with different ways to orient our meetings, different ways to orient our communications so that he could have that. And over time, he came to understand that I recognized the importance of this aspect of his work. And I don't mean to say anything specifically about meetings, because with every person you work with, it might be different for different people. But when you listen to what they have to say and you actually do something to address it, they're way more likely to feel valued and feel like, okay, this is someone that really understands what I need out of work and wants me to be at my best.
So it sounds like a lot of these skills really have to do with building relationships and enforcing those relationships. Traci, would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I think relationships are everything. Doesn't matter the industry what role you serve, the relationships it all comes down to the relationship. And this is where the buy-in is also so important, because if you don't get the collective buy-in from key stakeholders and even non-stakeholders, to me, everyone is a stakeholder, but that's my personal opinion, then you're going to have a much harder time making the impact that you want to make.
Definitely. Yvonne, you also, you work with a lot of professionals across the board. When you are talking with someone who works in technology, are there any other aspects of change leadership that you focus on, or that you encourage them besides the communication to emphasize, to improve those relationships?
Yeah, you know what? I love the way that Stephen just really broke everything down in terms of what it was that he was saying, because this is what we're going to do in 2 weeks. But what I want to do is even just use that as a case study in terms of what he did. I know we're going to do case study, but as a simple mini case study. Everything he did now, he demonstrated 4 to 5 skills of what a change leader has and what they have to embody. He, first of all, went with empathy, which we spoke about. He looked at things from that person's perspective. He looked at something from his stakeholders' perspective. He looked at it from his colleagues' perspective. He demonstrated empathy to understand where they were coming from. Another thing he demonstrated was communication and active listening, to say, let me listen to what it is that they have to say. He wasn't about, well, this is the way we do things, or this is the way that, we've set up the meetings, or this is the agile method approach where we have to have this touch points all the time. Yeah, that he listened to what the needs of his stakeholder was. And then he also demonstrated collaboration, and which was around saying, okay, let's work together. What is it that, you need to be able to make this thing, happen? And then, he empowered them, which we've been talking about, psychological safe environment, psychological safety. He created an environment where they felt comfortable and confident to be able to share. And he empowered them to be able to do those things. And that's what it is really about. And one of the things that when I think about technology, and, glad we have Stephen in there, I think I said something, I feel as if I said Andrew earlier on, but one of the things that, Stephen really spoke about is, or brought to mind, is that in technology, we still need those skills. He spoke about how, a lot of technology people are really in demand, but sometimes what happens, sometimes you don't find them lasting. There's this saying that you recruit people for their skills, but at the end of the day, you fire them for their behavior and, type of thing. So while they may be in demand, one of the ways that they can really make a difference is when they have some of these change leadership skills to be able to influence their stakeholders, to be able to go away from that mentality, which we're all going away from now, which is build it and they will come, bring in the change and they will come. Andrew, I would love to hear Andrew's perspective, but that's no longer the case. It's no longer about build it and they'll come. Employees are feeling more empowered to be able to walk away. So if you're not engaging your stakeholders and employees, they will feel they have the power, the autonomy to move away and find another solution. So in the technology space, it's definitely, I'm seeing a shift, and I have a technology background. I'm seeing a shift away from build it and they will come to how do we work with our stakeholders, collaborate with our stakeholders, communicate with them, use our social influence skills, create that environment, which, Andrew, did a great paper on, in terms of what people want more in the workplace. So a lot of what people will want in the workplace, other than technology, but from their colleagues and their leaders and their management team, is where they want that environment where they feel empowered to work. And that's where, when we all start to have those relationship skills, it makes a whole lot of difference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Yvonne. Let's see. Well, I want to continue to talk about how people in the audience can use these skills. And so Traci, let's see. Do you, as an HR leader, What competencies help you succeed? And what recommendations do you have for the HR professionals who are joining us today?
Oh, okay. If I narrow myself down, because the skill set is so transferable, right? We end up, when we use good communication skills, we use so many other things. But if I narrow it down, I think I would probably say transparency and authenticity in the same vein, right? Not putting myself in a position where just because I'm in HR, there's this feeling that I can't share certain things. I think transparency is actually really important. And of course, there's transparency to a certain extent, right? I'm not necessarily going to share someone's salary, but I can definitely explain how we come to salary discussions, for example. Transparency and authenticity, empathy is huge. One of the things that I would say has allowed me to get to this point in my career where I've started as an HR generalist, moved to HR business partner, HR manager, director of HR, and now director of employee engagement, is really in empathy and being able to empathize with people in various roles. I mean, my career started at Target, where I was in store, and I worked in a $100 million location. How do I relate to someone who's unloading a truck at 2 a.m? And so part of that is doing it with them. So being hands-on, to me, maybe it doesn't feel like a skill set, but I do think that empathetic approach coupled with being able to be hands-on and not place yourself above someone else just because you have a certain title. It's easy to say, it's harder to do, because we all get to certain places in our career by doing things, not doing other things, specializing, going, pursuing education and things like that. But, I do think that that focus on understanding and relating to people of various backgrounds and being open to listening, which I think Stephen mentioned really nicely, is that active listening and really having a genuine interest in what someone is bringing to the table, just as much as what you're bringing to the table, makes that so worthwhile. And I think one of the things that I love about HR, and I'll get to your second part of the question in just a second, what I love about HR is that we have an opportunity, not necessarily a privilege, yes, in some ways a privilege, but an opportunity, because we can take advantage of it if we want to really understand people. And I was just speaking with a colleague of mine that HR can be very polarizing. You can have really good HR partners and you can have really bad HR partners, and seldom are there those in-betweeners. I don't know that I've ever met someone who's somewhat good and somewhat bad. I think it's really those polar opposites. And I say that because it's those of us who take the opportunity to get to know people within our organizations who, do set themselves apart from the HR partners that create the stigma. And it's what I talk about on my podcast. It's the reason why I created my podcast, because I want every HR leader to see their position as an opportunity to elevate others in their roles. And so to answer your second question about recommendations for those of you who are in HR yourselves, and maybe you're not, I think everyone has an HR role in their organizations in so many ways, but my biggest recommendation would be to really understand the people that you represent and the organization that you represent. And HR does have so many different roles to play in an organization. There's obviously compensation, payroll, benefits, but there's also the track that I came from, which is business partner, director, manager, generalist, who are really more so connected in that almost in that crossroads between the organization and the people. And I think one of the biggest things that any HR leader can do, and one of the best things, is to really get to know the individual, listen, hear, but also challenge. Part of our role is to challenge the status quo and understand how we can get better and challenge people to elevate and get better. And so that's a whole lot of broad strokes for what I'm trying to say, but I do think it's as simple as that, as being true to yourself, getting to know people, and authentically representing them. And I hope that for those of us who are, HR professionals, that you go into every day where there can be frustrating moments, there might be things that you can't share with others. And it can be a very heavy existence sometimes being in HR, but I hope that you walk away from this today finding the levity in our roles and finding the creativity and the fun that can come with influencing others to be their best selves and to drive an organization to be the best organization that it can be.
Thank you, Traci. I think you've given a lot of HR folks out there some really great insight. So thank you so much. And now I'd like to kind of touch back on what Yvonne was talking about Andrew's report. And we have just a few minutes left before questions. But Andrew, there was so much information in this report. And if you haven't had a chance, he's posted it in the chat to take a look at it. But it really goes into how things are changing in organizations. And there's so much into it. But Andrew, if you want to finish up this conversation, what are some key elements that you can share with us about, Yvonne touched on what employees are seeking in the workplace, how employees are feeling at this time, and how that relates to change leadership. That would be wonderful. I know I asked quite a few things, so.
It's completely fine. So I'll take a broader point. And the bigger point is to not be too confident in assuming what employees need, want, feel. That's the biggest thing, is to not assume, it's to ask. I'm biased because it's what I do, is I ask employees. That's my job, that's my career, that's my business. But if I can just point out one stat that kind of highlights this. So one of the things we found is that 81% of executives believe their company has been successful in extending childcare benefits. Yet when employees were asked the same question, only 45% agreed with their employer. For women, that was 41%. So let's not be too confident in what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and let's ask employees. And it's not to say that their opinion is going to represent how well the company is doing, but let's not assume anything about what they need, feel, want, or fear. That's one of the biggest things that I can recommend. Now, I can go deeper into it, but I do recommend everybody checks out the report. There is some industry variation, some location variation, but that's one of the biggest things that I can recommend for companies. Beyond that, one thing is, like I was saying, role clarity. If you're going through any change, really highlight why the organization is going through the change, what the purpose is of the change, how employees' roles individually are going to be impacted, and then how is this going to affect their career progression? Whether you're merging, whether you're going through an acquisition, whatever change you're going through, people need to understand, how does this affect them in the present, but also how is this going to affect them in the future? And one of the most common things we've heard from employees, especially those hired during remote work, is they want to understand their career roadmap, the career trajectory, as well as the prerequisites in order to be considered for advancement. So as you focus on this organizational change, if you want that buy-in, you need to provide some of these basic pieces of information. And it can be overwhelming to say, oh, how am I going to keep all of this straight? Just ask employees. They're going to be your best kind of guiding light throughout this process, whether you're discussing the change before in a change leadership sense, or if you're thrown into it and you're managing the change. Either one, get employees' feedback. There's no reason not to do it. A lot of companies say that employees are their greatest asset. Well, part of that is their feedback, their ideas, their suggestions, their input, their ideas. So this is something that I genuinely believe in, as you guys can probably tell. And so it's just my recommendation not to make any assumptions and to go straight to the source. And like Stephen said, actually participate in that active listening.
And I love so many things that you talked about here, but I think it's so important to go to the source. I know in my experiences with change, it was, the challenges that came up, if you look at too high of a level, you really don't understand exactly the complexity of what's going on, why people are resisting change. And so I think, the best way to do that is just ask. Go to them, have a one-on-one conversation, and that's so much in the skills and the competencies that we're talking about today, is having the ability to listen, to have that empathy, to care, to stop, to pause, and say, hey, I just want to check in with you. What do you think about this? And another thing that we've been talking about, and I'm not sure how any of the panelists, please jump in at this time. I don't see that we have any questions coming in from the Q&A box, but it's really making this connection and having this employee really paying attention to what the employee experience is here. So we have some more time. Is there anything else that any of the panelists want to add?
So I'd like to just chime in on the employee experience, because I've been actually in organizations that have done it really well as organizations that have done it really poorly. And I guess I know what it's like to be in that situation where some change is dictated to you from on high. And I feel like the thing that I empathize with most, the worst feeling I ever had, is the people higher up in this organization made a change, changed my job title, changed my reporting structure, changed something else, and didn't even consider any of my input, didn't even give me an opportunity to give any input. Like, do I feel like I'll be happy in this spot? Or even, do I feel like I'll be effective in this new, differently defined role? It just kind of moves and moves. And I feel like that's what a lot of employees feel could potentially happen. I think that's like the initial fear instinct whenever a change is announced, whether it be a perfect example is anytime there's an acquisition, a merger or acquisition, right? New management, people know, okay, there's going to be layoffs, there's going to be, restructurings, just a lot of fear. And I think it's like what was being discussed before about how employees want to know, what does this mean for my future? What does this mean for my day-to-day? Because one thing I want a lot of people to realize is that even if we have, say, just 40 hours a week, that's still a significant amount of time. A person spends more time on their job than they do any other task, unless they have like 7 kids and they end up spending 60 hours a week doing that and get no sleep at all whatsoever. So people want to know that. And having, I'm old enough to remember before organizations were even realizing any of the stuff that we're realizing now about, what drives employee satisfaction or what drives organizational commitment, anything like that. And understand that, okay, this is actually a really big fear that all of a sudden someone's going to up and change what was a pleasant, good job that someone liked being at, all of a sudden turns into something where they feel underutilized, underappreciated, and they feel like the organization's trying to turn them into something else.
Yvonne, Traci, how can leaders kind of work with this? And I think we've talked about some of these, but what else would you add to that conversation?
All I can say is that I also I've seen firsthand organizations do really well and organizations do really badly. And so, Steve and I can really relate to this. I haven't necessarily had that type of change myself, but I do think if I were the person executing that change or part of that change, because so often HR is part of those decisions in so many ways, I think this is where transparency is so important. And just whether it's your leader or your HR partner or someone pulling you aside and saying, hey, there are going to be some changes and we might not really be able to make a whole lot of an impact on what that change looks like. But not only do I want to give you the heads up, but I also want to get your input on, what would be a make it or break it for you? What's going to be a deal breaker? Because I think organizations need to be very understanding that title and structure have such an impact on someone's career. And I have worked for leaders who do not agree with me on that and have been very vocal in saying title doesn't matter. And I'm like, if you change my title, we are going to have major issues, because we work so hard to get to a certain level, right? Like whether it's director, like I remember how I felt when I got my first director title. And I was like, oh my gosh, am I legitimate now? And it's not to say that my previous roles were not legitimate, but that's the importance that we place on those titles. And so much of it is the human experience, right? And like wanting to be categorized in a certain bucket. But that is how much emphasis and how much responsibility organizations need to have when it comes to making these changes. And responsibility to me is the term that's best placed, because if organizations, just go in making these changes without taking responsibility for the impact of those changes, then we have the situation that Stephen is describing where, you feel undervalued and unappreciated, because it's like, well, where was the consideration for me? But if you have an organization that's like, hey, all of these titles are going to change. We don't have a whole lot of flexibility because we're merging with another organization that follows this standard. What are some things that you absolutely do not want to see? And what are some things that you would really appreciate seeing? Because maybe it's a compromise. Maybe for Stephen or for someone else, it would be like, okay, well, I'm not going to get the structure that I want, but I'll have the title that I want. And on paper, that's what matters for me. And so that give and take is so important. And we say organizations because it's like this big bubble, right? It's this big, the people sitting in their ivory towers. But the reality is that we all make up our organizations, and we have to be part of that puzzle and have a piece of the pie equally, and be part of that discussion and the compromises that happen internally.
Absolutely. And I can relate to the titles, because part of the change initiative that I was a part of, we looked at titles. And and through that experience firsthand, I realized how important a title is. And for an organization, it's free, it's free recognition. So I think that's Yvonne. I think I talked over you. What were you going to say? I apologize.
I'm doing multiple things and also trying to talk, because doing some tech stuff as well. So one of the things that I wanted to add to what Traci had just said was, when I work with stakeholders, I work with leaders, and I work with, even on projects and sponsors. One of the things that I always say to them, that you cannot underestimate what just engaging with people means to them. You may not execute on what it is that they're saying, but the fact that they feel heard, listened to, they feel part of it, makes a whole load of difference. Some people may know that they're losing their jobs, but how you let them go makes a difference, where you bring them in, engage with them, have that discussion with them. It creates, such a huge difference in their morale, their mental well-being, how they receive the change, how they move on to the next job. People just want to feel valued, so just the engagement of saying, I hear you, I'm listening to you, I'm engaging with you, and this is why we may or may not be doing it. This is why we can, we cannot give you this job title, that you really want, because this is where we're going to. It makes so much difference when you just engage with people, listen to them, make them feel valued. And, that's a very big component for me when it comes to leading and managing change. I remember a scenario where I went into this project, and the project manager said to me, oh, why are you talking to the stakeholders? We don't need to talk to them unless, they have a question or they reach out to us. I'm like, that's my role from a change perspective, to engage with the people, to talk with the people, to talk with the stakeholders. But some people feel we're just coming, doing our project. We don't want interference from people. We want to move very fast. And what I say to them, in the midst of moving very fast, you find yourself at the edge of a cliff and there's nowhere else to turn to. And that's when everything goes, I like to say pear-shaped, but I realized that pear-shaped wasn't a universal term, but that's when everything goes haywire, falls to the side. And then you're now starting to say, where do we pick things up? How can we repair this? How can we fix this? How can we bring people on board? So we cannot underestimate just listening to people, the power and the value of listening to people.
Absolutely. And in the chat, Jen was talking about how it's so important to listen to people. And so thank you. Well, we just have a few more minutes. I'd just like to take this time to say thank you so much for this conversation. What a wonderful group of people. Thank you so much for partaking in this discussion today. And Yvonne, Traci, Stephen, Andrew, if anyone in the audience would like to, reach out to them, they're on LinkedIn. If you have any questions for Andrew about his report, just go ahead and, as he offered, go ahead and reach out to him. I just want to say thank you everyone in our audience who took time from their day to log in today and participate in the discussion. In 2 weeks, we will continue our Change Leadership Master series as we explore a case study. Please mark the date, March 2nd at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, and we hope to see you there. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for being here.